Kame House lobby. As always, this is a US East Coast lobby. We're in US East Coast 2, Ring Match Priority Lobby 02. This is a loser stays on lobby. The passcode is 2717. It is also available in our tweet at TUI_NK_FGC and should be in the stream title as well. Feel free to join in if you want to get some practice. We're starting a little late this week, but the overall plan for the stream and the practice is approximately the same. We are thinking about how to play our matchups, how to put together pieces of our game plans, and how to use all of our resources to optimize the team. We expect to be seeing a few more longer combos this week, now that everyone's settled in to playing more of the neutral. We can spend less time focusing on whether or not a particular combo is a good idea, or whether or not they'll be able to get to use one. If you have a fairly clear idea of what you have a chance of actually landing, and some good buttons to start your combos with, then you can spend your time learning which starters lead into which combos. Watching your meter more carefully also lets you make these sorts of decisions. So, combo awareness will be probably what the team is working on this week, now that most of the pieces of how to play their characters and at least some of their matchups have come together. It's important to make sure that you have your combos down before you start thinking about high energy tech, ways to deal with specific block strings and so on from the opponent, because those things are incredibly good at adding stress to you as a player. Trying to figure out how to get out of opposing pressure, then win or lose is going to end somehow, can be a distraction from learning to put on your own pressure or do damage and win that way. If it causes you to flinch, chances are that you've lost out at least a little bit. From this side, you'll see more switching between characters than usual, just to keep everyone up to speed on the number of opponents that you could need to fight at any given time. With both an upcoming patch, new characters, and some recent understanding changes to how the game works in terms of who's strong and who isn't and why, the diversity of characters you see in play has increased a little bit. There's still some pretty clear ideas about who is low tier and who is top tier, but the top tier seems to have lost a little bit of its luster, and the low tier is expected to be helped a bit by upcoming patch changes. In the end, constructing your team is quite a lot more likely, and of course everyone has the option to just casually play characters they like, rather than characters who are specifically considered to be strong by the community at the moment. Understanding this lets us shift the way we think about matchups to more of a broad spectrum of things. You're not necessarily looking to see what Vegeta does, but what characters who have similar flows to Vegeta do. This is only possible once you understand exactly what is likely to happen in neutral against various characters. Opponents like Piccolo are harder to keep track of in neutral, so characters with poor tracking like Gohan are more susceptible to that sort of character. Be careful when you're thinking about which of your characters needs to be on screen, because you need to consider whether or not they have enough meter to fulfill whatever task you intended for them to do. Making sure that they are capable of executing the reason you brought them in or wanted to bring them in based on their remaining health amount of meter available, and whether or not you have any sparking. All these things tie into whether or not you should try to use that character or bring in another character who is not necessarily as advantaged, but who can probably survive long enough to build up the meter to cause the effect you need. Brawly also has poor tracking, but he has poor tracking in a different way and has to take a lot more actions in order to make sure that you can't overwhelm him. That said, as discussed last week, Brawly is quite good at making sure that you can't predict what he will do after approaching you, and therefore can spend a lot more time trying to do that instead of playing at mid or long range. It's up to you to be ready for Brawly's attacks and make sure he doesn't get close enough to get you in what may not be damaging mix-ups, but often lead to bad situations anyway. He's also very good at building up meter for other characters to use, making him an effective point character quite often.
Get ready for battle!
While he can be countered with Trunks or Krillin, for example, who tend to either go under his attacks or over his head, a linear approach tends to lead to Brawly just being able to hit some buttons and hope things work out. More cautious movement is often required to at least force Brawly to use other movement options, which you might then be able to catch him recovering out of.
間に合って
俺の少しは役に立つかもしれない。ありだ。許さんぞ。まずいな。行くぞ。行くぞ。どうした。行くぞ。よし。今だ。ここだ。どうだ。行かさないぞ。そろそろ。どうだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。任せてください。捕まれ。バレー。カメハメハ。無駄だ。僕は加勢します。さっさとしろ。交代できません。そろそろ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。どうだ。行かさないぞ。お前の思い通りにはさせん。俺が殺してやろう。殺して静かないめ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。なんの感じがいっぱい飛ばすぞ。修行の成果を見せてやる。楽にしてやる。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。招待してくれ。楽しめそう。お前の思い通りにはさせん。そこか。終わりだ。終わらせてやる。
And with that, we have the triple threat combo finish.
あの時は本当にすみませんでした。大人になって一緒に戦うなんてなんだか不思議な感じですね。
Understanding how to convert off your knockdowns is also obviously important. But what is even more important than that is understanding how much damage scaling you are likely to get if you try to do it with certain attacks. Know which combos you can start with that lead into being able to close out with big metered attacks, so that you don't spend a lot of time on using supers that won't kill, especially level 3s or other large ones, simply because you manage to convert off something easy like Dragon Rush. The game is generally designed such that the easier it was to start the combo, the less damage you will get from any super or metered attack that you add on to the end. This includes EX moves, obviously. Everything does less damage, but those are big enders that cost you meters, so you care about it.
さてと
その
さてどうしたカメハメ
この星もろとも宇宙の塵にしてやる
By contrast, knowing that you can convert into a kill like that is important.
プレゼントだ
驚いたよ。こいつはどうだい？くらえ！やっ！だから逃げたく逃げてもいいよ。
行くぞ
どこ見てんのさ。やっ！逃げてもいいよ。
俺の
やがかる。
終わりだ
やるね。しまった。驚いたよ。
そこだな
その調子
殲滅する手塚
ここですよ
見切っ
なるほどそろそろ死にたいだろほら
行くぞ
ちょっと脅してやるか
問題ない見切った
そろそろ死にたいだろ生意気だよお前
俺が殺してやろう何なんだ死ね
その程度ですかここですよ
どこへ行くんだ楽しめそう
虫けらが頭を許さんこの星もろとも貴様らをゴミにしてやる1対1ならこいつ
殺してやる俺なら
Understanding when your opponent is likely to move forward versus when they're likely to stay back and block longer is key to figuring out how to make your own rhythm and how to build up your own meter as quickly as possible. This does not just apply to landing your Dragon Rush, though that is one of your best options, because a defensive opponent will eventually adapt to the point where they will tech out of your Dragon Rush because they were defending. Over time, however, you can speed up the amount of time that you spend waiting for that, such that you're not really reacting to them starting to block, and therefore they are also entering the mental state where they're ready to tech you, but rather that you begin the Dragon Rush with the expectation that they are going to go in defensive stance, which makes it a lot harder for them to tech in time. This difference between recognizing something your opponent has actually done and recognizing what your opponent intends to do is a large part of the difference you make in the higher and lower tiers of fighting game players.
俺が殺してやろう。そこまで。行くぞ。無駄だ。うまい。問題ない。立て直す。そこだ。逃がす。甘い。許さんぞ。許さんぞ。無駄だ。何かそろそろ俺も少しは役に立つかもしれない。しまった。さあ、楽しませてもらおう。調子さて、調子に乗るな。するなよ。こんなものか。許さん。この私にバリアを笑わせんな。宇宙の塵にしてやる。
In situations like this, it's easy to close out based on your understanding of your opponent's flow and your available meter. Part of the reason that this game is easy to execute the moves for is because there's so much tactics behind every action that's taken that it would be quite straining to ensure that the player also had to execute all of those tactics under extremely high physical stress. There are, of course, optimized combos for doing the maximum amount of damage, but playing good neutral and understanding the matchup flow can be just as good as actually practicing similar things. Therefore, do make sure that you spend at least the same amount of time on working on your tactics as you do working on your execution. With the number of combinations of characters possible in the game, and therefore the number of enemy teams you have to face, it's vital that you figure out how you want to play each matchup in a broad sense, and try to identify what a matchup is likely to be like based on your opponent's chosen characters.
It's all or nothing. Go!
One of the most difficult aspects to learn for your matchups is when your sparking would be used best. There are certain characters who have difficulty keeping themselves out of knockdown situations or other bad situations, and they often need to use their sparking to get out of it and cannot afford to use it for other purposes. Other teams who are better at pressure can use their sparking both in combos and just generally to get started when the opponent is close to dead, so that they can quickly finish off an opponent before they can get away, or just overwhelm an opponent with the extra frame advantage and other trickery that is allowed by Sparking Blast, to make sure that they don't actually get to recover and push them off.
こんなもの
驚いた。あんたの力が見たいわ。まだまだ17に片付けにしろ。
終わりだ。終わりだ。終わりだ。行くぞ。終わりだ。
やるね。こいつはどうだい？
調子に乗るな。
まだまだやるね。やるね。手を抜いているのかい？無駄だ。
今度は俺が相手だ。終わりだ。終わりだ。終わりだ。終わりだ。終わりだ。終わりだ。今度はこっちからやらせてもらうよ。死になさい。もうここまでだ。調子に乗るな。そう見てやばいですよ。調子に乗るな。そんなバカな。宇宙の塵にしてやる。今すぐ黙らせてやるぞ。楽しかったよ。
Of course, this becomes much easier if you have a good understanding of scrambles and characters who are good at dealing damage out of scrambles. Scrambles tempt most opponents to default to their strongest internal reaction. Offensive players will almost always try to hit buttons in a scramble and try to track where you are on the screen to attack you. You can use this to your advantage. Defensive players, similarly, will often try to defend as best they can in a scramble. But depending on where you are on the screen and what cross-up or trickery abilities that your character is capable of using, you may be able to get a left-right mix-up, or catch him in Dragon Rush, or just reposition yourself into a very dominant position based on this. It is one of the strongest ways to make an opponent predictable in a fighting game. Create a scramble that you understand even slightly better than they do. For example, as seen here, Kid Buu benefits in two ways. First, he can activate sparking to actually recover his health, and secondarily, sparking strengthens Kid Buu's pressure to the point where most characters have to go on the offense against him immediately because they can't keep up against that particular stress point. In this scene, therefore, it's a matter of watching for the right moment to activate sparking with Kid Buu, as he is the character, other than Gohan of course, who gets the most out of it. Whereas Vegeta Blue, while he has some good combos, those mostly rely on him having activated sparking already. So Vegeta activates sparking to do his combos, to extend them, but Kid Buu can just have it on, he doesn't care. This means that, one, you can in fact use this to activate things on Vegeta, and then make sure that you still have enough time with sparking available to switch in Kid Buu and get the most out of that using pressure. Therefore, there is a specific time in the matchup that you can find where your situation is positive. Given the way that the characters in this scene use each other as assists, it also becomes even more useful because Kid Buu now has two assists that are capable of helping him extend combos and pressure even more. If you are not aware, Sparking Blast does speed up the recovery time on your assist and allow you to do more stuff with it. Optimizing your sparking activation by team can be extremely important, because gaining advantage by taking out one of your opponent's characters at a critical moment is a strong tactic in the game as a whole. Make sure that you understand how to get the most out of your sparking, even if it's just realizing that a particular character on your team has more advantage when they are in, or more advantage when they recover a lot from big damage. Or you can go a step further and plan to lure your opponent into doing, for example, a level 3, using up a ton of meter, and instantly using sparking to both recover from the knockdown, usually it is the knockdown, and go into either pressure or pushback, and keep up that close range situation where you are constantly in danger of taking little bits of damage, which really won't matter as much if you are in sparking and just soaking it up more or less. Broly is a good person to do this with, but you have to find the exact correct moment to do it, especially since it is hard to use Broly as a point character and still lure the opponent into needing to hit him with a level 3.
俺も少しは役に立つかもしれない。なんだと。
Here we see another scramble. When Android 16 is in mid-screen and Krillin is pushing from far away, neither player has advantage, neither player knows exactly what they want to do. So they have to basically both hope that they guess the right thing. However, Krillin has advantage in these scrambles. Krillin is able to avoid Android 16's attacks far more easily than Android 16 can avoid Krillin's attacks, meaning that, in general, the scramble is in Krillin's favor. Krillin knows that Android 16's main attacks, all that can hit him, will come from approximately the same place. If Krillin chooses to defend, he knows what he must defend against. 16 does not know what to defend against, making it much worse scramble on his side. Broly, on the other hand, deals with Krillin a lot better by just blocking. There's no need to stop Krillin from doing most of his attacks, because Krillin eventually pushes himself out. Broly in particular is able to deal with this by using armored moves at the exact moment that Krillin has pushed himself too far out. Broly's armored moves at that range are mostly safe, and Krillin's various attack vectors that normally trip him up and allow him to keep attacking you and doing more moves don't work against Broly's armor. Usually this leads to Krillin taking far more damage than Broly can take even, except if Krillin uses the level 3, which is exactly what Broly wants to lure him into doing, so he can activate Sparking and get away. Furthermore, having Cell as an assist in that situation means that if Broly feels that something has gone wrong and Krillin has backdashed or set up another situation where Broly's armored attack was mistimed or was unlikely to help, you can simply call in Cell as an assist to lock them down and give Broly space to get back out. Any assist that makes this style of attack straight on, basically zoning style across the screen can cover Broly in this situation, allowing him to be very versatile with nearly all of the Saiyans in the game, and Cell being 10% Saiyan himself. Even adult Gohan can help with this, but it is a little bit harder to assure it, since the reason that Krillin probably managed to get away had to do with a jump back or a backdash. Therefore, Broly has to spend a lot more time waiting and looking out for when the opponent might be going for their Dragon Rush, because he is generally so good at defending otherwise that the opponent is often going to feel forced to use the Dragon Rush to deal with him. Broly does not have a lot of good options for going into the air to avoid it, but he does get to Super Dash often enough, just randomly, to make it work. Against long-range mix-up characters like Piccolo and Android 18, it is more important that Broly actually just block. These sorts of characters do not manage to do their damage through heavy supers and usually do not use their level 3 in this matchup. Broly can, however, soak up a lot of damage and then still use the sparking if absolutely necessary. It is a lot easier most of the time to swap Broly out, though, because he does recover relatively well, and then he can use the sparking when he comes back in the second time to protect his teammates from taking any more damage than necessary. Broly's ability to super dash in a lot of situations that other characters would have to feel a lot less safe doing it means he can put forward more damage without putting himself under stress. Since he also covers most aspects of zoning decently well, you don't often have to worry about those situations. When under slow pushback like that, Broly can often use a simple swap to his teammates to solve the problem. He's also a character who is good to bring in under those circumstances where he is the one coming in on the super dash, because he is so good at setting up positive situations off the super dash for himself. This situation is actually relatively strong in Broly's case because he can now be brought in with a standard switch and utilize his strong capacity to mix up at that spacing. Frieza must therefore defend himself by using the discs to force the opponent to take certain actions. Since Broly's way of dealing with this is actually relatively slow. But there you see the mix-up that deals with the disc problem. Broly's relatively large size and linear attacks, however, leave him open to the sort of long-range mix-up that is used by Android 18. Since she can also defend herself in many more situations than most characters, without being at any risk at all, Broly's longer, slower moves are often absorbed, and even if he does get a follow-up from it, she eventually wins out both on meter and being able to use her level 1 to get out of the way of Broly's offense entirely and counterattack by dealing damage. Broly's best option in this case is to use his crouch heavy as his main attack option, since the pushback on his crouch heavy when he is at maximum range prevents him from taking a lot of counter damage without the opponent once again going for the level 3. There are of course certain opponents that can do this, and convert off moves that will reach it. Piccolo and Teen Gohan are obviously capable of making these punishes, but as a general rule, Broly is not going to get hurt very badly for hitting his crouch heavy at max range unless it whiffs entirely. In this situation, for example, both of the remaining characters are easy to lock down with Kid Buu's pressure. But since all three characters are alive, it is difficult to get Kid Buu into play in time to actually use that pressure. This brings us to the concept of the swap-in. The swap-in character is the one with the strongest mix-ups of Super Dash. This character is optimally the one you bring in when you need to switch during pressure, or when you just need to get your other player out and you have approximately equal health on both of the others. This should be your default character to bring in when your opponent is low on health, but so is your current main character. You bring in this character to optimize the amount of pressure you can put on them, the stress you can put them under, and so on, in the hopes that you will manage to finish off your opponent's character before much else happens. If your opponent chooses to do the exact same thing at the same time, it is often still fine, because when characters clash in the middle of the screen after both of them have called in their backup and those backup characters have collided in their own super dashes, you've usually created a scramble, and if you are the type of character who gains pressure from aerial moves, chances are you're able to either backdash out of it in the air and still keep going, or win out just by doing exactly what you would have done if you had managed to hit them blocking. If you absolutely wanted to have the other character in, you are still probably capable of doing it. If you had the choice in the first place, all you have to do is get the combo started and then continue the combo with that character. So one easy way to remember it is that your character who is not good at doing pressure or forcing scrambles out of their super dash is the one you call when you are finishing a combo. And your character who is good at that is obviously called in to do that when you feel as if you need to get your current character out, or feel as if your opponent might block but you really want to switch for some reason. If you do not have the time to work out strategy based on how much meter you have or direct matchups and you just want a good way to start in your decisions of who to move in when, your best option is usually to do it this way. In this case, for example, Trunks can keep up damage and pressure from those positions, but Krillin generally is not as good at it. Therefore, in this case, if one wanted to try to think purely in terms of finishing the opponent off, it's easier to have Krillin in and continue combos with Trunks, who then would go back to playing neutral. Krillin's size and multiple of his moves allow you to do it more easily, even if he is a little more linear about it than Trunks needs to be. Once Krillin does get a combo started, he's usually fine finishing his combos on his own, but Trunks can also be brought in so that you can replace this situation. But as you can see here, that used 3 meters to do very little actual damage, and had Android 16 recognized that and woken up its Sparking, it probably would have all been defeated. Fails to beat the level 3, but now we have Sparking Blast Broly, who is basically impossible to stop. He simply has too many mix-ups out of his Super Dash for you to feel comfortable, and the amount of meter that was built up allows him to finish this out while still being a functional point character, because that's what he does. Trunks is therefore left with the stress of facing off with Broly and counting on his meter to save it. But he has no assist to back up this meter, so he's going to have to hope that he can clear it out in time. Unfortunately, what I assume was the execution error caused Cell to be brought in as an assist rather than a swap, and Broly did not in fact get to regain his health. Tactically, therefore, the situation has now gone back in Cell's favor, only if Cell can manage to warp around the screen fast enough, and without enough meter to do that, it's relatively easy for Trunks to just throw out long-range attacks and hope that Cell will eventually be caught in them. That said, it was a strong performance with the Broly in the same way that it was in the last match.
Brace yourself for the coming battle!
Broly's lesser methods of approaching Piccolo safely meaning that it's easier to play the neutral game with Piccolo in this matchup than in most.
All or nothing.
楽しめそう
But as you can see, getting Brawly out early enough solved the problem for the most part.
17号勝たせてもらうよ
And as previously broken down, while he can keep her at bay with a lot of his options, Brawly just doesn't deal with Android 18 that well. However, this is dependent on the execution capacity of the 18 player. Understanding how to use this sort of mix-up is also important.
こいつはどうだいくらえ手を抜いているのか17号その鬱陶しい口を黙らせてまだ17号そう簡単にはいかんぞ俺のエネルギーは永久に減らない俺はそう簡単にこの野郎行くぞ驚いたよこいつはどうだい生きた終わりだ任せ甘いな終わりだ生きたぞそうだな俺ならせいや覚悟はいいかせいや
Once again, the main strength here is creating the scramble. At that point, you can see a trick in meter watching that can be applied at the end of rounds like that. When your opponent is on the defense, they quickly have a chance to look at your meter and decide whether or not they are in danger of vanish or a level 1. However, when your meter is very close to full, dashing forward will fill it, making you immediately able to respond with super, or if they try for their own wake up super, immediately vanish out of it. So please note, when you are facing an opponent who does not have meter at the moment of knocking you down, you do need to pay attention not only to the number and the color of the meter, but to how much of it they would need to fill up in order to get to a required level.
Brace yourself for the coming battle.
The sort of mix-up is one of the strongest for finishing off unaware opponents that is possible, simply because it is a left-right mix-up, and most wake-up things lose to raw vanish. Do be careful when putting yourself into these situations as the aggressor though, since the opponent can wake up with both sparking and omnidirectional supers for characters who have those. This is strongest against characters with linear wake-ups.
調子に乗るな。
大丈夫ですか？行くぞ。本気で行くぞ。
さてくだらん。
どうした？
そろそろこの私にバリエがすぐに終わらせてやる。無駄だ。はあ、この程度か。そろそろカメハメハ。どうしたさあ、受けてみろ。なんだ地球ごと消えてなくなる。この全体をこの
地球は僕が本当に大切なものを守るには強くなくちゃいけないんだ。
Huh, I always thought that triggered a dramatic finish.
The outcome of this fight is anybody's guess.
Piccolo さん、行きますよ。トランクス、本気でかかってこい。
Get ready. Fight it out.
終わりだ。覚悟はいいか。頼みます。終わりだ。おのれ。ゼロセリア。覚悟はいいか。終わりだ。行くぞ。フリーザー。
うるさいね。
覚
さないぞ。どうだ。
究極のパワーを見せてやる。終わりだ。覚悟はいいか。
さないぞ。
バカな。
さないぞ。大丈夫ですか。
そろそろその程度ですか。どうだい。もうここまでだ。その調子。その調子。どうだい。虫けらがこの星もろとも貴様らをゴミにしてやる。
あいつ本当に強いよ。
俺のエネルギーは永久に減らない。
お願いします。17が離れてもらうよ。加減が難しいんだよ。そらくらっときな。見えた。そら黙っときな。いっぱい飛ばそう。
Jesus君に味方にしろ。
くらえ。貴様の相手はこの僕だ。17号。
やってやる。
黙っときな。どうした。17号。
分かった。
やるね。
覚悟はいいか。これだ。どうだ。
やるな。こう見えても僕は優しい。どうだい。虫けらが
大丈夫ですか。
宇宙の塵にしてやる。その手ちょっと脅してやる。そろそろ死んだだろ。生意気だぞ。その程度ですか。
あいつ本当に強いよ。17号。終わらせてやる。そらっち。黙っときな。黙っときな。そら。まだ。や。そら。
俺の
この野郎。そら。や。そら。黙っときな。黙っときな。これでも叩いてもらうよ。くらえ。
If you can keep your opponent busy enough in scrambles, or frustrated because of the range to keep on pushing them to, especially against characters who have linear supers, you can generally pin them down fairly easily. Their only option is to usually use this meter for raw vanish, which does not necessarily lead into enough that it can give them a real advantage. Similarly, knowing that you can also wake up with certain forms of defense means that their options are limited on two fronts, and they're even less likely to come up with creative ways to use their meter to damage you.
Get ready for a Dragon Ball Rumble!
However, do make sure that when you are doing this, you have a character who can at least do directly forward directional raw special. They don't have to be able to do multiples of it, just be able to do it at all.
大丈夫ですか？間に合って見えた。まだまだここだよっここだなんのここだそうだよっいっぱい飛ばす。どうした任せてください。ういまずいそこかやっ行くぞ。招待できますか？どうした？もうやろう。どうした？ここは任せた。ここか。スーパー最悪の容量で。全力でいくぞ。次は助ける間に合ってこの俺様だ。ういまずいな。目玉だ。まずい。逃がすか。はずじゃ。よし行くぜ。どうだ。よっと修行の成果を見せてやる。ビッグバンがカメハメハいっぱい飛ばすぞ。投げこいつだ。超大だ。忘れろ。まいった今度は俺が相手です。コテ兄ちゃん行くぞ。行くぞ。どうした？行くぞ。うわーうさんぞ。行くぞ。口だけは達者なようだな。終わらせてやる。バーニングそこだ。してきますよ。これが俺の全力です。
Looks like a little more lag than usual.
なんだこのプレッシャーは。もっと強くならなければまだ見
So
ぬ
probably a
敵を
little
倒す
check
た
on
めに
that, hopefully. And a switch in player from this side.
countdown is about to begin.
Bear in mind, therefore, that when you are trying to get your opponent opened up, using either your sparking or your meter, that blocking is a strong enough option in this game that most people can default to that. Pay attention to when your opponent has recognized that your attack strings are not real and are waiting to see when the problem appears in it that they can counterattack. You can sometimes take advantage of this yourself to stop it early, go for Dragon Rush because they're not expecting it, or just use a different tactic altogether just to throw them off so they don't recognize your attack patterns. It helps to vary your attack patterns a bit against people who are just being opened up due to hitting too many buttons. But you should generally do it fairly early into it so that by the time they get frustrated, it is your easiest or strongest combo that you are ready to use for maximum damage.
Vegeta, win!
これがスーパーサイヤ人ブルーだ。よーく覚えておくんだな。
Make sure that when you are knocked down, you do take that quick glance at your opponent's meter, because they may be planning something with it that will involve you being baited or otherwise damaged for anything you try to do. Losing your focus at the critical moment would generally allow your opponent to break your defense, and if you happen to not be defending, there's a good chance that they have set themselves up in a place on screen where they have almost all of the control and advantage. This is particularly true when your opponent has 3 bars of meter, as most level 3s are either extremely fast, invincible, or both, meaning you have next to no chance of actually reaching the opponent when that happens.
Ready? Go!
スピードには自信があるんだ。カメハメハカメハメハ行くぞ。ここは譲ってやる。もう出ますか。楽しめそうだ。俺は
相手だ。とっておきだ。
何なんだ。いいだろう。もう
いっぱい飛ばすぞ。取材してくれ。
何なんだ。行くぞ。楽しめそうだ。こいつはどうだ。くらえくらえ。カメハメハこの私にバリアを
許さんぞ。大丈夫か。
ここは握ってやる。俺が少しは役に立つかもしれない。行くぞ。もちろん行くぞ。
Characters like Adult Gohan, who have extremely strong crouching heavy and standing heavy, are able to use these moves to pressure opponents who think they can push on your defenses too hard. Since you are unlikely to live or be baited into anything from long range, it's easy to just hit these buttons when the opponent is trying to pressure you. If they have not been using their heavier pressure, their quicker buttons. This in turn can encourage them to do so and give you more chances to get out of any pressure with swaps or raw vanish, as it will generally interrupt any specials that they try to do from their ranges. A further bonus is, of course, that the proration and the overall damage from your stand and crouch heavy is quite low, which means that you get to do a lot of relatively unscaled damage. This both helps you keep control of where the opponent is in the air, since understanding how your super dash works relative to this is usually quite clear. But it also allows you to keep the character that you have in for longer, because they will tend to have made the opponent less likely to do certain things.
The outcome of this fight is anybody's guess.
As seen before, Broly's capacity to zone Frieza has more to do with Frieza's willingness to use his discs than anything else. The discs not only stop Broly from super dashing, but if Broly happens to get around them and launch his own attack, they can still catch him when you're on your way back. Frieza does not, however, have the sort of strong, crouching, or standing heavy that Goku is capable of using to set up the situation to be more in his favor. Therefore, the difference is that Goku can deal with Broly once Broly actually gets to him, but Frieza is better at preventing that from ever happening. Goku Black is similarly good at just hitting Crouch Heavy or whatever as needed to solve his problem, but is the worst at keeping Broly away from him due to the fact that he not only lacks zoning moves as a whole, but doesn't tend to use his evasive moves in the same way as the others, and therefore doesn't tend to get out of the way. He's much better at handling Cell, who relies on very precise positionings to get a lot of his trickery done. Goku Black can violate those expectations of position and save himself from many things. But in this situation, it's easiest to just get Black back out and have Goku handle Broly. Or obviously solve it that way and move Broly out of the fight altogether. However, you can only count on that for so long, so it's best to often switch to Goku any day, just to keep the situation in your control. Barking is therefore often best kept for Goku Black to make sure that if anything does happen, he at least has one wake up or one get out of move free attack to save him from Broly pressure. Black can cover most of this on his own if you are aware of when you're going to need to use that spark. However, with 3 opponents all in position, it can be relatively difficult to make sure that you kill the one you need to kill. And without that, the pressure on you in terms of keeping your own meter up is high. Generally, high mobility characters, or characters who have the same good mix-ups of Super Dash, will give Frieza more trouble, and Goku Black much less trouble. Goku Black has the option, in all cases, of simply moving out of the way, whereas Frieza's warp must end in an attack, and is usually an attack that rips, making his recovery longer than that of Goku Black, and making it more difficult for him to push on people correctly. However, Frieza does dominate fairly heavily over Kid Buu. To the point where our players, having played against each other so often, are basically just having a gambit as to whether or not to switch out Frieza, with the entire expectation that Kid Buu will also be switched out just so that there's never any chance of anyone having to play that matchup. The tactic part then becomes the effort by one player to make sure that the final part of the match comes down to Frieza versus Kid Buu, and the opponent trying to make sure that it comes down to Frieza versus Adult Gohan. However, you can of course take moments like this, where Frieza is in, to do your best to take advantage of that and get some damage on the board on that character. Goku Black's strong forward moving stand heavy, combined with the fact that it evades a lot of aerial attacks, means he can also get out of certain pressure without actually doing anything specific. But understanding his need for the wake up more so than any other member of the team means that one either tries to get advantage as early as possible or use sparking to wake up. Another tactic seen strongly there is utilizing the Beaker to do the second part of the super to call in your helper character to cover the space in case your opponent manages to dodge freezes. Some teams are much better at this than others. Understanding what type of player you are in your own scrambles is most useful for helping you figure out what your opponent is probably thinking about you. If you know what your own autopilot is, it is more useful than knowing what you should be doing. It takes a while before any of us is specifically doing what we should be doing in these games. Knowing what your tendency is, therefore, helps you pick up on when your opponent has realized that weakness or tendency and is trying to take advantage of it.
ぱい飛ばすぞ。どうだ。残像だ。曲がれ。よっ。空曲がれ。逃がさないぞ。届き者が。どうだ。逃がさん。神の力を見るがいい。
仕方がありませんね。
逃がさないぞ。ハンナー。逃がさん。受けるがいい。我が刃見えた。
やれ。
One advanced part of the tactics of swapping characters in this game comes from the understanding that certain characters have stronger super dash mix-ups when the super dash was done toward a grounded opponent from the air. This allows you to get even more mix-ups than would normally be available by simply noting that you should be going up or down when you call in a particular character, since they don't all have the same properties in those situations. Frieza, for example, is stronger when called in with you in the air after certain types of knockdown or fallout, and is therefore easy to call after Goku or Goku Black have done a move that pushes them into the air and causes them to hang there. Similarly, it is easier to call Goku to help you both as an assist normally and charging in on the ground when the opponent is in the air and Goku will end up flying up toward them. His ability to target them on the fall with his various Kamehamehas and spacing setups mean that he's stronger on that sort of approach. Goku Black is only really good when called in directly from the ground because none of his moves do a very good job of catching an opponent knowing where they're going to be and so on. From that position, if he is going up or down, he generally tends to whiff. As you can further see, another good reason to wake up with Sparking in the corner is that if your opponent does not have a lot of meters, even if they do manage to catch you in your defense mode, it takes so long for them to deal certain types of damage that you just tend to survive based on regeneration alone. It's not often enough for a comeback, but in a clutch situation where both players are low on health, the offensive player is actually at a relatively heavy disadvantage because even if they are landing their attacks, it's still not enough. This will eventually cause the defending player to build up meter to defend themselves, so not only is the Sparking defending you from one wake up, it may be enough to stretch out your meter to defend you from two.
The battle's about to start. Good luck!
力がなかなか孫悟空なるほどそれならそうそろそろ
As you saw there tactically, seeing if Frieza managed to get advantage is really not much of a loss to you. You can spend your time trying to do this, and then when you find that you have not managed to get the advantage on the player, even though you have the technical advantage, if they are too patient, if they are too aware of the matchup or those things, you still haven't lost out that much because it's easy to switch Frieza back out at some situation and recover his health that he lost during the process. Bring him back in later when you have more meter to put more stress on the opponent with. Another useful moment there, using the sparking even though it had to be used early, to not only recover health, but generally force a gain of even more meters so that if Frieza is brought in, he's able to do more damage. Goku is the least powerful character against Kid Buu of that team, in general. Whereas Goku Black can at least wait out certain types of attack, or watch for when Kid Buu has put himself in the wrong situation, and work out things from there. But as Buu generally cannot stand up very well to Frieza's ground explosion, or he has to risk letting Frieza get into the air so he can defend against the ground explosion, he doesn't have a lot of direct options in this matchup. It's important to make sure that when you play a certain character, that you are either willing to be daring with their moves to test what they do, or willing to do enough research to figure out which thing is the most effective for any situation. It mostly comes down to whether or not you're the sort of person that prefers to watch videos and read up on characters, or experience it yourself. A good way to decide this is simply how easily frustrated you are by things not going as you expect in games, or by the opponent seeming to have options you can't beat. If you are the type of person who loves to experiment, you're likely going to eventually hit the right button even if it is a bit frustrating to lose on the way. If you're the sort of person who prefers to defend strongly, you may want to read up on or find some video that explains how to do it, since you're much less likely to consider all your options as easily or throw out buttons in the hopes that you will get what you want.
おお、なるほど。虫けらがこれでどうだ。虫けらがあいつだよお前。どうだい。後悔しますよ。出番ですよ。そろそろ死にたいだろ。出番ですよ。
驚き者がやり裂く。あんな逃がす。神の力を見るがいい。どうした。今のうちに下がるんだ。逃がさ。神の力を見るがいい。逃げないぞ。貴様ごときに。調子に乗るな。大丈夫か。
仕方がありません。甘いですよ。
あんな受けるがいい。さっとしろ。逃がさないぞ。僕も加勢します。強靭な肉体に勝てる者などいるものか。大丈夫ですか。これ以上好きにさせんぞ。お前はもう終わりだ。完全に消え去ってしまえ。破れるとは。
生き残らず生かしては返さんぞ。そこですか。虫けらがこの星もろともまだいける。なるほど。そろそろ死にたいだろ。立つならどうだ。今のは言ったか。甘いですよ。なるほど。ちょっと脅してやるか。しまった。
これ以上好きにさせんぞ。お前はもう終わりだ。完全に消え去ってしまえ。
おお、なるほど。そこですか。おお、ちょっと脅しなさい。この星もろとも貴様らをゴミにしてやる。この雑魚どもめ。
この世界の平和は俺が守る。これで終わった。ありがとうみんな。
Dragon Ball Rumble.
Because Krillin, Gohan, and Trunks can be played so well both offensively and defensively, it's difficult to bait these characters into doing anything that the player doesn't want them to do. This game also has a high incidence of relatively safe moves, and you're generally blocking and waiting to see when it's your turn at the end of a block string. Spacing is therefore super important, but so is taking advantage of the fact the game has so many safe moves to launch your own attacks. Even if the only purpose of your attack is to control space, you're often better off doing this than waiting for your opponent to make their move. In short, even the zoners in this game must move enough to make the opponent think about something else. Fortunately, Frieza has his warp attack, which, while it does not have the same ability to move around the screen as most others, can still be used to change his position on the screen in ways that are confusing enough for most players to have to worry about it. Pure zoning with Frieza is about making use of his evasion. Therefore, if you try to defensively zone and move very little, he loses a lot of his effectiveness. As your opponent gets better anyway. Goku is better at the defensive pure zoning, but he still has to move. Of the three characters on this team, the one who is most capable of zoning without moving is in fact Goku Black, given that he has both his standard energy wave that crosses the screen, like that, and the ability to do a basically command grab Kamehameha. This is reactable, but in the situation where the opponent is being kept out in the first place, you can generally feel out when they're probably going to defend against you, and use that moment to land that attack. Frieza's ability to hit basically anywhere on the screen with even his regular attacks is what makes this the most possible. Since the opponent has to spend so much time thinking about whether or not it's a good idea to move, there are, as you can see, a lot of moments like that where the knockdown has been achieved, and you can use the command grab Kamehameha instead, because your opponent is expecting the regular one. The mix-up between those two alone can be enough to get you some damage and help you close out rounds.
が直々に相手をしてやろう。これが神の技だ。嘘だ。こっちだ。軽い。行くぞ。まだまだ。嘘だ。
Strong defense in this game can absolutely run out the clock though, even if it does seem as if you should have a lot of time to play it out.
悪さなんてさせないぞ。大人になって一緒に戦うなんてなんだか不思議な感じですね。
So it's perfectly okay to work on defense first and look for your moments to convert it into something else. The key is to look for those moments and not get caught up in trying to make them, as the game does not tend to have a lot of capacity to force things to be the way you want without using a lot of meter and without being guaranteed that it will even happen.
Are you ready? Fight!
ちょっと脅してやるか虫けらが。生意気だなお前。なかなかそのなかなかそこまだまだ手番ですよ。受けるがいい。我が刃。うわー痛い。ダイナマイトキック。いやダイナマイトキック。
カンナ調子に乗るな。すぐに終わらせてやる。神の力を見せてやる。まだ強靭な肉体に勝てるものなどカンナ終わりだ。無駄だ。私には通じん。受けるがいい。私を待たせるな。こちらダイナマイトキー甘い甘い。暗い。ダイナマイトキー受けるがいい。我が刃。カンナその調子。俺にさカンナ破れるとは。今度はこっちからやらせてもらうよ。お前そこですか。しまった。地球ごと消えてなくなれ。やつならどうだ。この雑魚どもめ。
言ったろフリーザー、お前では私に勝つことはできないと。不意打ちでも狙っていたのか。残念だったな。
It's often important when you find yourself in a rut with certain characters to check why that's happened as a whole, and to just change some of your options around to see if you can get anything else out of it. For example, if a player has reached the point where they feel as if they've reached the limit of what they can do with their own current characters, it's often stressful because they are more likely to lock themselves into certain styles of play based on what they think is supposed to be done. You can get around this by changing two characters who have similar playstyles but are unfamiliar to you. This forces you to think more about what you have been using in particular spacings and situations, and why you would have wanted to have any options in those situations at all. Obviously, we all want to have options. Options are just better than not options. But the specifics of those options can change quite a lot. Therefore, it's important to make sure that when you have made a decision about those things, you can commit to it on basically any character. Obviously, it helps to be able to play them as a generality, but knowing that you have options that don't exist on your own character, in other words, forcing yourself to recognize, hey, I'm missing this thing that my other character does, makes it a little easier to recognize why you played them and to see what you could do in situations that are similar looking with moves you didn't think were possible. In short, when you're using characters you're familiar with, you already have preconceptions about what moves work and don't in what situations, and you're less likely to try to use moves and discover new aspects of them. Switching to unfamiliar characters means that you must now re-explore the game and try to figure out what is possible from the perspective of basically complete ignorance, or if you've played against those characters enough, a rudimentary understanding of what they do when you're facing them. Because most of us do not see our opponents as limited in games, rather we see ourselves as the ones with the limitations. It's easy when we feel limited by our stressors or other things to switch to characters that our friends play that are in some way similar enough in terms of style that we can imagine that situation. Those characters don't usually feel to us as if they are weak or lacking options because we're used to seeing them in the perspective of someone who is focused on playing them. Therefore, we know at least a few things that work based on having them used on us rather than thinking about them in the sense of whether or not we know how to land them. This frees us from the feeling of, I can't make this work, because we've seen it work. We don't know yet why it doesn't work, and we don't know when it doesn't work. We don't necessarily know how much work the opponent that we faced has put into using it or protecting it. One particularly effective way for this to happen is when you are playing with someone and getting frustrated. Both of you take the other player's character or characters in this game and see if you can make it work. If you can mimic the style that was beating you and your opponent somehow manages to beat it, then just watch how they do that.
やりすぎたかな。クリリンさん、引退しても力は衰えていないな。僕も見習わなくちゃ。
Brace yourself for the coming battle!
So our goal in this match is chaos. Going in with zero understanding, checking one's own autopilot, one's own defensive reactions, concepts of what certain things are for, and using that to get a new idea of how to play the game. Universal mechanics are usually enough to carry you through matches like this where you're just getting the feeling of a new thing, without you having to worry too much about being unable to do anything at all. Many of the fundamental requirements of the game are the same on all characters. Remember that these sorts of things are about using other information to treat a measuring stick of your own mindset in the game and how you choose to approach situations. Do you tend to try to get in? Do you tend to try to use your special moves to control the situation? Do you try to defend regardless of whether or not you feel you have the defensive tools?
Time to begin the match!
All these things tie into your understanding of both yourself and your own characters who you are currently not playing, because it's easier to see when you have been relying on a default. If that default works really well, good. If you realize you've been over-relying on it, and when you face the same situation with a different move, you can't think of anything else to do. The goal in this type of match is not only not to try to win, but to just go so far as not even trying to figure out how to win. Your general goal is to observe yourself while you're just autopiloting. And you're just using the extra characters as a contrast to whether or not your autopilot is actually effective in many situations, or if you're just doing things because you think your own characters are capable of doing it. It helps to pick the game's concept of complex or low-tier characters, doesn't necessarily matter which, as those are the most likely to lead to you not being able to actually do anything you normally do. Captain Ginyu is useful in this situation due to simply being so unconventional that nearly nothing you expect from any other character is likely to work. As opposed to, for example, Android 21, who is conventional but only if you know how to do enough certain things to make her that way. Or if your opponent's character choices make it possible for you to drain enough abilities to play her in a conventional way. So, spend a little time in matches like this, learn how you choose to solve your problems, your tendencies when you're under stress, and how willing you are to branch out and do different weird things without being confident that they will actually work.
出番だ。想像以上だ。行く。本気を見せてやろう。
これ以上好きにさせんぞ。お前はもう終わりだ。完全に消え去ってしまう。フリーザ様。スーパーサイヤ人の壁。
If you matches like that, then you can easily return to the comfort of your own normal characters with a new knowledge of why it is you've been trying to solve particular situations in particular ways, or just a general understanding of new characters that you might be interested in, if nothing else. Perhaps it went particularly well. But if it didn't, it's a lot easier to see when you have made your tools the primary way you deal with situations.
This should be a great fight. Ready? Let's go.
生意気だよ。そろそろ死にたいだろ。生意気だよお前。そろそろ死にたいだろ。そろそろ生意気だよお前。そろそろって虫け。そろそろ死にたい。そろそろ死にたい。
相手だ。
そこだ。
貸さないぞ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。どうだ。いっぱい飛ばすぞ。
任せてください。これでも食らえ。そこか。これでも食らえ。生きた。これでも食らえ。これでも僕
宇宙の塵にしてやる。甘いですよ。そろそろ死生意気だよお前。虫け。これでどうだ。生意気だよ。そろそろ死にたいだろ。
今オラの出番だ。 調子に乗るな。働く者が指先。逃がさん。どうした。許さんぞ。調子に乗るな。どうした。お前は次にかんな。
これ以上好きにさせんぞ。お前はもう終わりだ。完全に消え去ってしまえ。
調子に乗ったなんだって嘘だそこか
誤算だったな。敵だって成長するんだ。俺も気を抜いていられないな。
Brace yourself for the coming battle! Are you ready? Let's go!
おそろそろ死にたいだろ
Counter!
そろそろ死にたいだろおその調子なかなかしまったその
次の砕け中
その程度ですか
この程度か。
オラが相手だ
さて
Fantastic!
やれなかなか虫けらなるほど
今オラの出番だまたまた
さて次の砕け中無駄だ。
Also remember that in this game, anything that is not a true block string can be parried because deflect is basically frame 1. The difficulty is in understanding whether or not that's going to be a thing you can do as a whole because of the opponent being in the correct spacing. But if you find that you can't get out of their combo, wait for a quiet moment in it, or something that seems that they've been hitting you for just long enough. Just guess, basically. You've been hitting me for long enough, I'm going to try to deflect you out now. This is particularly effective when you're in the corner, but it's not required to be just dead. A perfectly timed deflect is often enough to catch your opponent entirely off guard and set up situations that are very advantageous to you. But note that generally the reason the situation is advantageous is because you have caught them off guard. Of course, your opponent, therefore, will have to try to defeat it by basically stopping attacking. Which sort of achieves what you want anyway.
神の力を見るがいい。こちら。
We're now going into our last match of the night. Tomorrow's content is likely to be at least some form of how to improve segment. Using a totally different fighting game, probably. It's best to separate such concepts from the games you're currently playing so that you don't go in with a lot of preconceptions about what is required or not required. So if you happen to let us know which one you prefer between Tekken, Genius, and Dead or Alive, we can work on that from there. The content itself may differ based on which of those three is chosen. Of course, join us next week for Mishmash Now, Street Fighter V on Monday, and Guilty Gear Tuesday training. Wednesday will be more Street Fighter content, possibly Sandbag Casuals. And we'll be back to Kame House next Thursday as always. On behalf of the TNK team, this is Meridian for another Kame House lobby. Good night, everyone.